I grew up in Nepal. Many people don't even know where it is in the world, but it's a small country sandwiched between India and China. And my father is Nepali, but my mother is from Iran. So my parents met in India when they were both attending school. They went to journalism school together. And then got married and moved to Nepal, and so I was born in Nepal, grew up in Nepal. And yeah, I mean, I always kind of think back now on kind of this bicultural, identity in Nepal, which was very homogenous at the time, and kind of try to think of how did I navigate all that, and I think part of what made it not so kind of stand out so much is the fact that being in Nepal, going to Nepali schools, I think I embraced the Nepali side of my identity way more than the Iranian side. And so, that's sort of a little bit about my background. My mother studied journalism with my father, but ended up being an educator. She started a school in Nepal that was really for, students from marginal backgrounds. In Nepal, the caste system is huge, class is a huge deal. So there are all these kind of various categories by which people are left out. And so my mom created a school that was really geared towards, providing progressive education, but for kids of, all backgrounds. So in many ways, she was real pioneer in that area. And my father was a journalist by profession, and he did a lot of he was the editor of the national newspaper at one point in time, but I think as he did all these, somewhat high profile jobs in journalism, he realized that really his passion was at doing grassroots work. And so he spent kind of, the second half of his professional life really working at the grassroots with small organizations and really thinking about how to democratize mass media, how to democratize access to information. So a country like Nepal is, there are mountains on the top, and then there are hills, and then there are plains. So it's a very geographically challenging country, and so depending on where in the country you live, access, like even physical access, is really difficult. So what he realized when he was the editor of the national newspaper was that there's all this information being printed out, but it's not actually getting to very many people. And so that became his pursuit, is how do you get information out to as many people as possible, but also how do you empower people to create information that's of value to them. So he started this newspaper called the Wall newspaper that villages in Nepal would create for themselves. And so him and a team of other folks would go out to all these villages and kind of work with people to train them and to, in writing and producing and so on. So this became, the Wall newspaper became something that was widely adopted, not only in Nepal, but all over South Asia, where communities were in similar situations. And he set up some of the first community radio stations in Nepal too. So you can see that with both my parents, they were very much focused on activism and social change and so on. So I feel like much of how I think about my work is a direct kind of connection
they
to
influence
them.
Your
Absolutely.
Your
I think, certainly kind of the big move to the US was very eye-opening in many ways. It's going from a context where I felt very much like I belonged and I was, part of it all, to a place where I was suddenly this outsider and different in so many different ways, was one where it kind of, was a little bit of a shake-up of like reality. Suddenly it's like you're viewed in a different way, and that sense of belonging is a little different, and that was a little bit of a shake-up, and I do think it reaffirmed kind of some of what I had to constantly kind of think of myself and who I am and why I'm here and so on. And sometimes I think for those of us that come from communities that are generally underrepresented in college culture or higher education, there's always this sense of kind of I feel like a huge sense of responsibility, that we're in some ways representing so many more people and our families and so on. So I feel like for me that was really big, coming in with that sense of responsibility. And for that reason too, I felt like I always almost burdened myself with this question of, like, what are my values? Like, how do I want to be in these spaces? How can I not let these spaces, shape who I am? How do I want to experience the opportunities that are in front of me? And I feel like that has kind of continued throughout, really always kind of thinking about like my personal integrity and being true to my authentic self in whatever space I'm in, has been really important to me. And I feel like those were the beginnings of realizing that, okay, I can either, kind of assimilate and just go based on people's expectations, or like I can challenge some things and resist some things and decide for myself like what parts of it I want to take on. And it wasn't always easy, of course, as you all know, but I think I became comfortable with the challenge. Where not just the context around where I grew up, but on my mother's side of the family, there's a history of religious persecution and having to flee their home country, and really my mom's side of the family is dispersed all around the world, and they've had to create an identity wherever they are and a new life, and I feel very connected to that as well. So I feel like those experiences just remind me that the work that I do, whether it's as faculty or as dean, associate dean, or as really anything, has to be done in a spirit of service. That if I approach it in any other way, that it's not going to have immediate impact. And sometimes we think of impact as like this thing that happens later, like I work for 4 years and then, hopefully at that point something big will happen and people will say, oh, the contribution will be great. For me, it's more about the everyday interactions and, the everyday decisions and what kind of processes I create. And those types of things, I think, for me, are a direct result of, my background and kind of really having to see things in a very practical way too.
Shabnam, how do you
Yes.
define leadership?
Define leadership, oh my gosh. I don't know if I have that like eloquent one sentence definition, but like I said earlier, I think we so badly in our world right now need a reimagining of what leadership means. Like I think about that a lot, like in the current political climate, and the types of leaders that are emerging. and I see that in a lot of other areas in which I'm involved. I think leadership being very top down, and leadership being like, leaders having to act a certain way. And for me, like, I go back to my earlier point, which is I think leadership really should be, about serving those around us, and so that's how I understand it. And I also feel like leadership is inherent in all of us. Like, I think we all have leadership qualities, and so it's really about sometimes recognizing those attributes that are essential in creating those leaders that can really bring about changes that can transform. And some of those attributes for me that are important are like, people who demonstrate kind of an understanding, who take the time to really understand their context and to understand who they're working with, to get to know the people they're with, who understand the capacity in everyone that they are with. So it's not just thinking that I as a leader now have to do everything and then I'm deemed a good leader, but I think oftentimes some of the best leaders I've worked with or I've seen or experienced are those that thrive on seeing other people do really well. So to me that's really important. So those are the types of attributes that I see. So I think leadership is more about being able to have a vision for where you want to go, but really then having the humility to be able to engage in a collective process of moving that forward by lifting people up, and moving towards a common goal. That's, I feel like, the big question now. But I guess in my own work, I can share like how I try to do that. One, I think, is just by always pushing myself to raise my consciousness. And I don't feel like as leaders, I don't think that leaders always feel the need to do that. I think leaders always feel like, okay, we're in these positions because we know certain things and we're going to push what we know. And then what's missed there is this sense of humility that, we don't know everything as human beings. Our knowledge isn't absolute, and if we don't seek to learn, that, at some point what we know is going to be irrelevant. And I think I see that. So with things like racism and sexism and homophobia and all these things that we see in institutions, like the reason why sometimes there's a disconnect between what the leaders are saying and what people on the ground are experiencing, I think, is sometimes a complete lack of consciousness too. I mean, it's not only that, but there is that where this group of people is like experiencing and learning, and it's a dynamic place, and things are happening, and it's static up here. It's not dynamic. And so when the set of people who are experiencing are saying things, it's not even registering, right, in the consciousness of people, because I think there's just this kind of, it stopped at some point. So I think that is an issue. So I think constantly learning and having that posture of learning, like what I always call a humble posture of learning, like that's just your posture, is really other things I feel like budget and things like that. It's a very difficult time in general. I feel like even at this institution where we're seeing huge deficits and we have to cut and so on. But how do we do that in a way where people trust where the leadership is coming from. You know, you can either say that and people will be like, yeah, right, you know, you guys are making that up. Or you can kind of bring people into your confidence and explain it in a way where people get that this is an institutional issue that we all have to kind of get on board and, you know, do something about it. And I think that latter part has always been my strategy, whether I have to do the budget or something. I'm always consulting with people, like, what do you think? Like, do you think this is a good idea? Or like, will it really, you know, affect your department functioning if we make these changes and things like that. And I think that's really, like, how we do things makes such a difference. And I feel like sometimes as leaders we're always looking at outcomes, you know, like, okay, so now I have to balance this budget and at the end of it, it should match up to be this, this, and this, and I just need to get there. And we don't often think about process. And I think that's really critical in leadership, is always thinking through process. It's always thinking through how do we get to that point. And sometimes, you know, when you engage in that process and when you're open to, you know, other people's contributions, is I think when sometimes you even come to an outcome that you didn't even envision, which is much better than what you would have single-handedly come up with. And so for me, the process of consultation and the process of kind of, you know, discussing things with people, I mean, sometimes there are institutional barriers where you're like, there, you know, confidentiality issues and so on. But that aside, beside that point, I think there's a way in which you can create a culture of consultation, where people feel like they're able to give input, or they feel like they're part of a decision process. And then when you make the decision, you know, whether it's good or bad, or it affects us positively or negatively, at least we've all been a part of the to kind of in our heads and in our minds and in our practice, like always be thinking, like, as we gain awareness of some of these issues, like how can we actually deconstruct some of this, you know, like, and then, but hand in hand with the process of deconstruction has to be the process of reconstruction, you know. And what's required in that reconstruction for us is a whole new, like, process of reimagining, you know. So as we're deconstructing, how are we kind of also reimagining, like, how things could be? So these are things that are not working. We gotta slowly chip at it and bring it down, but how do we then construct something completely different? You know, we have all these habits of thought and we have habits of action. And when we don't break those cycles, or we don't bring a new consciousness into it, is when we just keep doing things the same way, and then the issues continue. But I think for educators, for leaders, it's really important to even recognize that it's possible to make that shift. So as we learn new things, how are we using those new things to reimagine our own practice, or to reimagine how we lead, or reimagine, like, how I interact with my students in a classroom setting?